Welcome to MP University. In this session, we're going to be talking about extending Unix and Linux monitoring using shell commands. So the agenda for this session is to discuss and demonstrate some security considerations when you develop your manager pack for Unix and Linux machines, and how to produce a command that requires no additional processing by the cross-platform resource pool, testing and validating your commands, and finally plugging it into a workflow. So in my experience, one of the biggest problems when developing a manager pack for a Linux machine is security related, because as a manager pack developer, typically we are very well versed in how action accounts work and how security works on a Windows machine or within Active Directory. And this is one of the main points of this topic here with security considerations on a Linux machine, where Active Directory or a Windows account is not a part of the equation, where we need to consider how security works within a Linux machine. Apart from just understanding the basic security requirements to run basic shell commands within Linux, is documenting those shell commands and those sudo file requirements within a management pack. Because in any development environment, we may have a sudoers file that is configured with an action account that has root access to everything, and this is very common, especially when you go out, on the internet. And I could take I'm partly to blame for this. I've written an article on how to install an agent and monitor a Red Hat Linux server. And in that article, I have described how to do it by essentially using a root account. Not necessarily a root account, but configuring the sudoers file for the Ops Manager service to elevate with no password on anything and everything that is run by a workflow, a monitoring workflow. So again, there are many blogs out there that demonstrate this type of configuration, which is, I believe, why there are so many misconceptions and problems around monitoring Linux machines for any application, really, because the security considerations are really not taken into consideration, because we just expect that the Ops Manager service account is in the sudoers file and it has access to everything, which is a misconception. So we should not assume that the monitoring account on any machine, including Windows, has administrator privileges to access any kind of resource on that machine. So the first thing I want to demonstrate in this session essentially is what does it look like when we run a command using an account on a Linux machine that has root access compared to an account that we might want to set up for the operations manager service account on a Linux machine. And the reason I want to demonstrate this is because it directly correlates to what we do and how we write our manager packs. So I'm going to connect to a machine in my lab. It's an Ubuntu 10.04 machine. And I'm gonna connect to that via Putty, and this is something that you would want to do potentially when you're developing your manager pack to monitor something on a Linux or Unix machine. So you just download Putty. It's a free tool. Just search for Putty. You can download the executable. And just type in the IP address or machine name of your Linux machine. Click open, and for myself, I'm just logging in. Okay, so I logged into the machine there using my account that has root access, and then on the other Putty session, I'm going to log in using an account that I have set up with an operations manager, and I'll show you in just a moment. So that this one on the right is the account that's specified in operations manager to be my Unix Linux monitoring account. And just to give kind of a visualization of what that looks like here, if we go to the administration space within the operations console under Unix Linux accounts, I've got my ops manager SVC service account set up 2 times actually, and the only difference between these 2 accounts, and I can show you within the console here, is just essentially one option, and it's this drop down here. Do you want to use elevated privileged access? So essentially the only difference between these 2 accounts, and it's the same account on the Linux machine, but it's 2 different accounts within Operations Manager. And the only thing that sets these 2 accounts apart within Operations Manager is simply this option here. Do not use elevation with this account, or elevate this account using sudo for privileged access. So if we take a look at this account, we see it does not use elevation. And then if we take a look at the other account, we can see that this does elevate this account using sudo. Okay, so that's the only difference. It's the same account on the Linux machine, but within Operations Manager, it is actually 2 different accounts, and the only specification there that differentiates the 2 accounts is the fact that one has elevation and one does not. And it's essentially saying to the SDK, to Operations Manager, put in front any command that we run for monitoring or discoveries, put in front of that command sudo. That's it. So it's a very simple, extremely simple concept that is really misunderstood. So for example, again, on the right we've got, we're logged in using the the ops manager service account that has been set up within the sudoers file, and we run a simple command such as uptime, and we see that we get the results. So let's say we want to list all uptime or upstart services, and we run that command. As we can see, it doesn't necessarily say that access denied or anything like that. But if we put sudo in front of that command, then we see that we get a list of all services. By the way, I've heard different interpretations of sudo. Some people call it pseudo. I guess there's no way to really say what's right or wrong. However, I learned a lesson when I was working for a company a few years ago, and working closely with the Unix administrators over there, and just kind of having an off time lunch break and speaking freely. And I asked, what do you call it? I asked one of the Unix administrators there, what do you call it? Is it sudo or sudo? And he made a very good point. He said that what does a super user do? And right there, it pretty much answered the question. So a super user does, right? They don't do. So super user do. Yeah, well, for us Windows and Microsoft people, it doesn't really make sense to, do, but it certainly doesn't make sense to do. So, yeah, I believe the correct term is sudo. Anyways, that's off topic. To continue with the session here, let's see, where are we? That's right. So looking at the commands here, if you've ever looked at a sudoers file on a Linux machine, you can simply do that if you have a lab environment, or any environment where you can have sudo access to the sudoers file. You can simply type in sudo vi sudo. Yeah, there I go again. I called it sudo, but it's a sudoers file. And then you enter your password, and then we take a look at this. Is a pretty simple sudoers file, but as you can see, the ops manager service account that I had set up is, I'm going to give an example here of that. One is commented, one is not commented. If I comment out this line here where the ops manager service account has access to that init CTL to display those upstart services, if I comment that out and I save the sudoers file, and then I go back over here and I try to run that command, now it will ask me for a password. Remember previously it didn't even ask me for a password, and then when I type one in, it will tell me that this account does not have access because it's not specified. That access is not specified within the sudoers file. So if I go back here and I uncomment that line, and this is, as you can see, I'm only allowing access to this privileged resource, right? And that's it. That's it. Apart from, as you can see, this other line here where it says no password all, that means essentially the service account, the operations manager service account has access to run anything and everything and can access any resource on that machine without requiring a password. This obviously is not the preferred configuration in any customer environment, and we wouldn't want to make any kind of demand on a customer to configure their sudoers file for the ops manager service to access any and every resource on that machine. It just wouldn't make sense. So the point of this is, now that we've uncommented this, we can go back and see that if we run this again, list, so we can list all services using the ops manager service account, and it doesn't require a password. This is the requirements. So from a sudoers file perspective, this is good. This is good. This is what we want. We want no password, right? And then we want to specify whatever you're developing in your management pack. We want to document, essentially document which programs that the management pack needs some kind of privilege to access and to run, so that we can monitor that particular application. So in this case, for listing upstart services, we would need to document within our management pack that we require elevated access to initctl. So /sbin/initctl. Wherever the customer has that particular program configured, it would need to be documented within the management pack, because it directly correlates, again, remember, to these two accounts. And this is going to make sense in just a minute, but for the meantime, let's go back to the slide deck. So we've talked about the security considerations. Next is filtering a shell command. So oftentimes us Microsoft engineers and management pack developers and SCUM admins, we're very well versed in PowerShell and VB scripts and things like that, but shell commands in Unix maybe a little bit different. I mean, we still have regular expressions and things like that, but one of the things that we want to get to when we're creating a data source within a management pack is, obviously, we don't want to introduce any kind of burden and have to do any additional processing after we've retrieved data from a system. So we like to, preferably, we want to get down to a data source that provides very specific data points. In this case, in this session, we're talking about performance data. So we're looking for, either an integer, a double, or, maybe an unsigned integer or something like that. But we want essentially a number, and that's all we're looking for. We don't want to create a data source that provides a huge bag of data that we need to further process, because it just wouldn't make sense to develop a management pack to execute some kind of a script or something like that, and to provide a ton of data, and then have to manipulate the data in some way. It doesn't really make sense to do that. It's not really conducive from a processing perspective. However, there are cases where we do need to do some additional processing beyond the data source, and PowerShell scripts in terms of Unix monitoring may be very useful to either manipulate the data. We don't necessarily want to manipulate it, but we want to capture certain elements from a stream of data. And specifically for multi-instance workflows, we just might need to go through a script. So we might need to process that even further. The next thing I'd like to show is a demonstration of how to essentially come down to not necessarily cook down a data source, but arrive at a shell command that's going to produce some very succinct results that are easily consumable by operations manager. So with that said, let's jump back to our shell window and our terminal session, and let's just go ahead and exit out of it. Oh, okay, I already exited. So one of the outputs of this session is to collect load average of a Unix or Linux machine. So in my environment, I've got an Ubuntu 10.04 machine, and I want to collect load average over a 5-minute period. So uptime, the uptime command actually provides this information. Okay, so we don't want to simply execute uptime in a data source, and then this is a perfect example where we would have to process this data further in Operations Manager, in a workflow, in a management pack workflow, to arrive at this 5-minute uptime. So preferably we want to take this uptime command and maybe grep or anything we can do to essentially carve out the exact data that we need. We certainly want to do, and this is by no means any kind of a Unix, how to create a shell command to get the precise data that we need. I mean, you're definitely gonna have to work with your Unix administrator to come up with a command that provides this precise data. The only reason I have this here is because I've been through this, and I've actually created a load average data source and collection rule and unit monitor for a previous customer, and the customer was able to provide the command for me to arrive at the precise double results. So what we need to do is actually take that uptime command and do an awk on it. And awk is essentially basically a regular expression. We're doing some filtering there, and we're looking for load average, and then what we want to do is we want to print out, print, not very Windows like, but it's definitely Unix syntax. Is we want to print out that load average. So we're looking for load average, and we want to print the second, essentially, parameter, and that gives us the result here. So which is good. We're getting closer to what we actually need. But if we go up and we pipe that, we're all familiar with PowerShell. We can pipe the results to another command, and there's a command, a very useful command within Unix called cut. So what we want to do here is we want to cut from these results, we want to cut this, because this is the 5-minute load average. So cut F2 field, meaning the second field, we get the results of just this field here. So and as we can see, and it's a good practice to just go ahead and trim off any spaces, because I just know that from my previous work that there are spaces in here, and we can see that. So it's a good idea just to go ahead and trim those, and it's kind of a basic best practice to do that. But if we can take a look at the results from this compared to this, we can see that there was a space that was trimmed off there. So taking this command right here, we've got the full command, and we've got data, we've got results that we can absolutely use, and this is very easily consumable by SCOM. We've got a double, right? That's we can absolutely convert into performance data and make use of. So a couple different ways we can actually validate our PowerShell, our shell commands, is we can actually use some PowerShell invoke methods, which are kind of interesting. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but just want to show that using some commands like this, and I will actually put this up on the screen in just a moment and show you exactly the command I'm running, so you can kind of pause the session and get all the necessary elements that you need to run something like this. So as you can see, I've got the command up here, and everything here you can just run, and the only thing that you would need to update is this particular part here, which is the command equals, and that's your shell command. So you can actually set up like a function, a PowerShell function in your development environment where you just pass in, a shell command and receive results like this. Oh, as we can see, this particular one, it's funny. So if you actually take a look at this, it gave us the result: unable to connect the system bus, blah blah. So that is a perfect example of an account that does not have access, or requires sudo access. So I took the same command, I put sudo in front of it, and I run it again. And we have the list of upstart services and their service state. The only problem with testing your shell commands within PowerShell like this using the wsman invoke methods are special characters. And because special characters are, as we all know, if you've developed management packs already and you are experienced with that, you know that we need to wrap special characters within C data tags within your management pack. It's kind of the same concept here. So now, invoke wsman doesn't necessarily use the same interpreter as Operations Manager SDK. So if you have some simple commands that you need to run and test and validate, and you can certainly create some kind of a PowerShell function to do that, and you could pass a command into it. But if you have commands that are awking and grepping and doing calculations where it requires special characters, including double quotes, percent signs, and things like that, this may not be a good way to test and validate your shell command. This is the very reason why I actually prefer to create a console task to test and validate shell commands. So going back to, let's see, where are we? I don't want to get too far ahead. So we've created the load average over 5 minutes command. Yep, I did jump ahead. And we talked about Putty, wsman invoke PowerShell methods, escaping special characters. So console tasks. Some back in the day, not too long ago, I would actually receive some kind of a shell script from a Unix admin, and what I would do is I would go in there, I would go into the operations console, because I knew that this was the only way to really validate whether or not I'm getting correct and valid data from the SDK, was creating a console task. So I would go into Operations Manager console, I would create a new task for every single shell command I would receive, and create a new task, put the shell command in there, save it to some test management pack and execute it. And it was just a really long process. Create a module where I can input as configuration to a task a shell command. So this is what we're going to take a look at now. Let's see, we got I'm not going to bore you with a bunch of examples of XML, but we'll take a look at very simply how we can do this. So if you take a look at this shell command probe action within the Unix shell command library, if we this is actually a very good way to learn development, period. You just take a look at some of the modules that are within the built-in management packs, and we can see that we do have a very useful module here, a probe action module, that we can definitely see some really good potential for creating a console task. However, there's only one problem with this module, and we can't create a task based on this module because we can't override anything. And the thing that we want to override is the shell command. So if we want to create a console task, we essentially need to take this entire module, copy it, and pasted it in here. So the only difference between what we just looked at and this particular module here is the fact that now we have override parameters. So we've got a shell command here, and we can override that. And not only that, in addition, I decided, hey, why not allow the operator to override the timeout too, because it just makes sense. It just makes sense. So so in this module, we see that we have overridden or created an overridable parameter, which is the shell command, right? So if we look in the console, I've already imported this, and you can see that if we go to monitoring and click on any Linux server state, and we see in the tasks we can certainly execute, and then you see this command shell, or I'm sorry, shell command override. We can override that. We can put in any shell command that we want. It's going to be interpreted correctly, so long as if we have some of those complex shell commands with special characters, as long as we escape those special characters, we should be able to validate our commands with these tasks. So right here we see just by the uptime command we get that. So what about the more complex commands that we were running earlier? For example, let's take a command such as this. Let's try this. So again, we've got a command that we can see all the special characters involved in executing this command. We get good results here, 176.28, right? So what if we were to execute that same command here? And just to show you, we're going to just paste not the same thing. We're going to paste the same command in there, right? Same command. Override it, run it. And we have a problem. It doesn't understand awk. It doesn't understand this special character, broken pipe. Either way you look at it, there's an error, right? It's because there are special characters. And let me put this up on Notepad. So if you take a look at this command here, essentially what we need to do, and I've got this already pre-baked, essentially we need to put in these escape characters. I'm sorry, we need to escape these characters. So we've got a backslash there in front of the double quotes, a backslash there in front of the double quotes, a backslash there in front of the dollar sign. So if I were to take this command right, I just pasted it. Same thing. However, now we have the backslashes in there, the escapes. We're escaping characters there. Escaping special characters, that is. Now we receive results. So back to the session. Agenda, let's see what we got here. Okay, so create a load average data source and collection rule. We don't have much time, so I'm just going to, again, I prepared for this session with already prepared code. So the data source. So what we have here is the data source. I just realized that I skipped over part of it here, meaning we looked at the probe. However, we didn't actually take a look at the tasks that we have been executing within the command shell, these two tasks. I apologize for that, and let's take a look at that real quick. And this is actually very important too, because we do have two tasks, and one of them is runs under the regular action account, and one of them runs under the privileged account. And this is a direct correlation to what we see here. This is the regular action account, and this is the privileged action account. And if you recall from a few minutes ago, we're talking about what are the differences. It's this selection here. It's either this or this. There's only two ways you can go. So you set up the same account with these two options selected for each one. You select a different option. So it's basically saying, does this, when I execute this particular workflow or shell command, do I put sudo in front of it or do I not? Just as an example of what we can do here. So let's say we want to take a look at some privileged resource. So our shell command, maybe, I don't know, let's take a look at the sudo response. I believe it's there. And we can take a look at what kind of information we receive back. And there we go, permission denied. So let's run the same command here with the execute command shell privileged. Okay, same command, and we're going to run it. Let's see what we get. So now, as we can see, we can run that same command using the regular monitoring account. We see it as a failure. It's a failure. We don't know what it is, but we know, we know that it's because sudo was not appended to the front of the command. So if we execute the shell command privileged, right, we run the same command. Take a look. Let's run that and we'll see what we get. There we go. We get a list of services in their running state. So the last part of this, we're not going to spend a lot of time on, and we'll just do a quick review of the code because this session has already went way over time. We've created our configuration data source for the tasks. However, for the load average data source, we do want to leverage that command shell or shell command probe action within the Unix library, and we'd simply implement that and pass in our command. So this is a good data source that we can use for a monitoring workflow. We can simply collect it if we want, or we could pass that data into a unit monitor and evaluate the return data to determine whether or not it's in a critical or a warning or a healthy state. In this session, we're only going to be talking about collecting the data because only time only permits to go that far. The only thing I want to point out in this is that the expression filter here, it may look very confusing, and this is really forklifted from other cross-platform management packs. Essentially, what we're doing here is we're saying, we're asking, is the data valid for one thing, and does the module return any data? That's it. Pretty much, it's just saying, is there data there, and is it valid? So at the end of the day, we create a collection rule, which is pretty simple. The only thing that we need to provide is the interval. So we've already imported the management pack, so we can actually take a look, and there's a view that's already been created. We can see that load average, those samples have already been collected since we imported the pack.